Good morning, Bears. We are diving into kind of a standalone, but not really because it is Black History Month. Last week we dove into Martin Luther King, which is kind of a classic. That's why they put Martin Luther King's holiday on in Black History Month. But today we're going to tie it into the ancient civilizations because I don't think Black history started when America started. Black history goes way back. We've already tapped into them. The Kushites, the Nubians. There's different names in ancient culture. And so we're going to do a little bit of primary source. Remember, a primary source is evidence from something that was written from the time period. So if we were studying, say, Martin Luther King, when we listen to him talking, that's a primary source because he was talking. If we listen to a guy that yesterday wrote an article about Martin Luther King talking, that would be a secondary source because he is telling us about Martin Luther King who lived 50 years ago. Now, Martin Luther King speaking, primary source, and we have video for that so we can go watch him speak. A guy talking about Martin Luther King today, secondary source. Now, when we go back to ancient civilizations, we did not have video, so we use our documents. Sometimes it can be papyri. And for us as ancient civilization historians, it's a little more challenging because they had paper, they had pictures hundreds of years ago. Thousands of years ago that we're studying, most of the items that survived were either in stone or artifacts like pottery, necklaces, and we've done some of that study earlier on. Now, one of the things that did survive is the Bible, the Torah, the Old Testament. Remember, the New Testament starts, the Christian worldview starts. We studied that a little bit at Christmas. At time zero, we now call it Common Era begins around that time. And then they used to call it BC, before Christ, but now we call it before Common Era, BCE. So just if you hear somebody say BC, before Christ, they now call it BCE, before Common Era. And then the old way, and some people still saw this after the death, and there's a Latin term that they made it basically after Christ's life is the new era. Well, to keep it simple, we now call it before Common Era, BCE, after Common Era, and so then we can figure that out. All right. So let's get into the history here, and we're going to watch a video that's a modern day history from a young lady, very powerful, and about American history, that basically Black history is American history. Then we're going to dive back into ancient times, and we're going to look at the primary sources of Numbers, which is in the Torah, and we'll see the reference that Moses married what today you'd call an African or a black person. Now the terminology changes. You'll see when we saw Martin Luther King, they referred to the population as the Negro population. We all know the bad word that nobody should ever say because that's become a negative word, very negative word. The other word that Martin Luther King that I just said is not a bad word, but they change the context because a lot of times words have meaning and they take on some negative context or maybe a degrading context, which is negative. And so there's nothing wrong with coming up with how you want to be referred to. Even today, some people don't want to be called boy or girl. I think it used to be okay to call women girls. Now my wife says you're not supposed to call women girls. So I get confused myself. So we do the best we can. And we don't want to judge anybody too much if they make little mistakes. But in general, it's okay to say that Mr. Downs has brown arms. I'm brown. They might call me a white person, but I guess, but do I look white to you? I'm pretty brown, and it's not just from the sun. I have a browner skin tone. In the Moses movies we saw, Moses looked to me, they put him about the same color as his wife. That may or may not be true because the Nubians, as we saw with our study, were probably a much darker skin color. So we're going to dive into history and see that because we're talking about Black history. So I love it. And if anybody has any thoughts about it, let's do it. So we're going to do two sources. Very modern source on Black history. We'll watch that video. Then we'll dive into elements of an article. I'm going to have you read that article. We'll read some of it out loud, and we'll look for some history of the Kushites from actually Africa in the time that we're talking about in ancient Israelites. and then we'll look at the primary source and numbers. All right, let's do this. Let's start with our video, Black History Month. This girl's really good. Girl, am I allowed to call a girl? Lady, woman. Once again, terms are confusing. Let's do this.
How do we define Black history? Is it a plethora of stories about slavery confined to a single 28-day or 29-day month? Is it a watered-down, 2-hour version of what the Black experience is really like? Or does it look like your tired peers in your 9th grade social studies class complaining to you about how exhausting it is to be learning about Dr. King for the 10th time since 2nd grade? In light of our current socio-political climate, the need for non-conventional Black stories to be integrated into American history and English curricula is at its highest, because they convey to students the adversity African Americans face on a day-to-day basis, and how several of them have learned to create and innovate in spite of this. Now, I was raised in an environment where several people I
just want to pause this real quick. You're going to take evidence from this. We're basically doing, it's in the groups. Our basic is top slide on Black history. Now, you can focus on American history, but I want at least one tie into the ancient history and one tie into American history. So she's going to talk about Black history in America. You can do your own research, but in your CER today, in that slide, we need to show elements of modern day, last 200, 300 years American history, and I want evidence from our citations of ancient Black history, and you're going to put that just into an informational slide about Black history. So pay attention here and look for interesting elements. Maybe even take a note. Maybe have your slide open if you know how to do that. And if you hear something interesting, you can type down those notes.
was close to didn't look like me. My mother is a Pacific Islander, my father is Black, and for all my life, we've lived in an area populated by a small minority of Black family, friends, and overall students. In school, we were taught lessons about several European inventors and innovators like Leonardo da Vinci, Charles Darwin, Albert Einstein, Susan B. Anthony, Christopher Columbus, Abraham Lincoln, the list goes on. But I could never necessarily fit myself into the mold of these narratives solely because they were presented through a lens that I could not personally identify with, and they didn't feature individuals whose stories even vaguely resembled my own. Now, granted, we would learn about Dr. King and Rosa Parks when February rolled around out of the school's own obligation, but it gave me the impression that all people of color have been doing for these past few centuries is fight for their basic human rights and do nothing else but protest the white patriarchy, and that the world only held one man and one woman responsible for paving the way for the civil rights movement. I wasn't exposed to the idea that people of color in this country could be artists, inventors, or politicians until I researched this realm of learning in my free time. I had no idea what Black history looked like until I became aware of the struggle in which several Black artists and innovators' voices go unheard or masked, the struggle in which European history can often be learned within a core curriculum, but Black history can only be learned through an elective. The struggle in which our textbooks turn a blind eye to the way people of color have revolutionized the way we live our day-to-day lives. Take Shirley Chisholm, for example. In 1968, she became the first African-American woman to enter Congress and eventually seek a presidential nomination in the United States, despite housing an underfunded campaign and being restricted from participating in any televised primary debates on a discriminatory basis. Chisholm managed to enter 12 primaries and accumulate 152 delegate votes during her run, due to support from African Americans, women, and other allies from across the nation. Her story is solely representative of one's resilience as a person of color in America and as a woman in America. Then we have Lewis Latimer, a brilliant inventor and engineer. In 1881, he collaborated with Hiram Maxim and Thomas Edison in order to invent the light bulb. Latimer himself created the carbon filament, which is a crucial component of the light bulb, and although it may seem insignificant, his contribution to this invention paved the way for one of the most groundbreaking devices in history, which is why our history textbook should continually recognize him for the vital role he played. Finally, there is Jacob Lawrence, a highly renowned artist due to his paintings which depict the several everyday narratives of African Americans and historical figures. After developing an art style which showcased the overall vibrancy and diversity of Black neighborhoods, Lawrence went on to become the first African American represented by a New York gallery in 1941. During a period of widespread hatred and bigotry within our country, this man was able to display the extent of his creativity to the world, despite being considered far from capable of doing so. If we as a society are hesitant to create a push for more diversity in our English and history curricula, it creates a potential divide in what certain students feel they can and cannot be, and it limits what they feel is possible to achieve as individuals, all because of the fact that several educators failed to shed light on the many contributions made by African Americans throughout history. And although nearly impossible to integrate the teaching of Black history in all schools nationwide, several educators and teachers have begun to implement it into their own individual curricula as a first step, to name a few. We have Jamila Pitts, a former English teacher from Harlem, Manhattan, who utilized the Harlem Renaissance in order to open up her students to a wide variety of African American narratives and how they have taken strides to showcase Black creativity from the 20s to the mid-30s. Mike Cackley, a former social studies and English teacher who chose not only to give a brief lesson on the Civil Rights Movement during Black History Month, but integrated lessons about African Americans in the context of war and foreign policy discussed in his class. And Mrs. Zane Stearman, an English and avid teacher here at Mission Vista who strives to incorporate Black literature by figures such as Langston Hughes and Martin Luther King Jr. in order to demonstrate their creative brilliance to her students. Hearing Black stories not only sparks inspiration in the minds of young Black students, but it imbues a sense of pride in them, allowing them to come home and tell their parents, hey, they look like me, when referring to brilliant engineers, writers, doctors, lawyers, etc., who've essentially paved a way for the youth of this generation to live in prosperity and work toward an overall state of solidarity in American culture. Because Black history is American history. This country we live in, the soil we walk on, and even several devices we use day to day originated from the minds of several Black innovators. In the near future, I want young Black boys and girls to be able to sit in their history classes and take part in a curriculum that features the stories of people like Shirley Chisholm and Lewis Latimer. The youth of this generation should have the ability to skim through their English and history textbooks to reveal several people who they feel they can empathize with, people they can strive to become. And with this newfound knowledge of the great minds that came before, students of color throughout the country can reach their full potential and work toward creating a better future for our nation. In turn, this can certainly benefit the worldview of other people of color as well as non-people of color in America, because our country is a monumental blend of identities, even extending outside of the boundaries of a single race. Incorporating Black stories simply opens up discussion regarding the people of color as a whole, provoking questions among educators such as, what can I do to contribute to breaking racial stereotypes? Or how can I convey to students that success does not align with a single ethnic origin? By incorporating these ideas within a classroom setting, our schools would be taking a step toward overall acceptance and solidarity by showing students that historical triumphs can be made by individuals of any origin. Thank you.
Oh man, that girl's a rock star. Awesome. Okay, we're going to take a little break here. Let's go into our slideshows. Samantha, man, way to step it up. Before we forget, I'm going to let you guys quickly jot down a couple of notes. How do we do that? And I want to show you Samantha's slide after this. We're going to use your slide, Samantha, to do a little review to get ready for tomorrow. But created a slide. Notice Samantha's got some skills. Has her backgrounds going. So every background's like this, which is fun. It's okay to do that. When we look at her slideshow, you're going to see that she has a consistent pattern of something she likes, but she also always has the concept. So that's fun. I want you to have fun. Now, here we got to have our box. Let's go text box here. And what we're going to make is, I just want you to write down a couple of thoughts from the video. So write down 1, 2, 3 thoughts, notes, facts, etc. from video. Anything you want. And then we're going to talk about it real quick. Don't have a lot of time if we're going to get all this in to do a long breakout room, but we might if you're in Zoom. But right now, jot 1 to 3 thoughts while it's fresh from that video. All right, let's do that now. We're going to share out if we're in Zoom, but what are some key things that you need people that look like you to inspire you? So even in my own personal class, in Zoom we'll hear from your stories, but for people that aren't in Zoom, for years when I've taught ancient civilization, there was a little section on the Nubians or the Cushites, but not that big. Now, if the newer textbook is much more expansive, but for years I remember thinking it was so cool that you can go back and see that even though they dominated each other, like the Israelites dominated land, the Egyptians took Israelites as slaves, the Egyptians took Nubians sometimes as slaves, but the black communities in Africa were not victims, because at times the Nubians, the Cushites, were a massive empire. I don't know if you remember, they controlled all the way up through the pyramids, around into the Nile, and around into Canaan. And how do we know that? We know that from some primary sources in our research. So Black history, because we're an ancient civilization class, we're talking about American history because it's relevant to this month. But we're really tying this back into ancient civilizations. I doubt anybody knew, if you check this out as we go to our primary source, and this is our transition into our next notes, because remember, top slide, some evidence from the video that we just watched. You should have those notes written down already. And now some evidence from our primary source and a secondary source about this primary source. But take a look at this. First, let's go to our article first. Let's take a look at this article, and I'm going to give you a second to read it. But Cush is a country. The Nubians, the Cushites, there's different modern names, but here is a quick summary of it. The word Cush means black. Biblically, Cush, and remember, we're talking biblically because we're talking Israel. So the Torah, or biblically, Cush is the son of Ham and the father of Nimrod. He is considered the ancestor of the dark-skinned people that occupied Ethiopia. His name is often associated with Ethiopia, but there are some who are still skeptical about it. Cush, remember, everything in history, there's a debate. Cush first appears on the biblical timeline after the flood. The place in the Old Testament, Cush usually refers to the countries in the south where the children of Cush, Ham's son, lived. Many assume that Cush consisted of Arabia and the country of the west coast of the Red Sea, since it was linked with the southern limit of Egypt. It's associated with Elam, Persia, and the Sabians. However, there are some indications that Cush also existed in Africa and Ethiopia. We know that the Cush impacts were below Egypt in Africa and the Ethiopian region. Now we can go and look at all this. That's modern Cush. You can browse this if you want. But this is the part I want you to focus on, because this lists all the time that Cush was mentioned. Remember, everything's debatable, but bottom line, we know about the Cushites, the Nubians. They controlled a lot of stuff. That's a fact. We have artifacts showing the dark-skinned people as the pharaohs. Remember, they called them the black pharaohs. And now here in Genesis, or the Torah, we have mentions of Cush. And then here we have Cush as the father of mighty warrior. And then here's the interesting one, Numbers. Moses married a Cushite woman. Well, this is a secondary source just telling us this. Let's dive into the secondary source. Here is the Torah, or the Old Testament. It's Numbers 12, 1 through 10. And let's just read it from this source. Remember, this goes way back, ancient times, in oral traditions. And all the studies show that oral traditions are very reliable. But even the written version of this, we have copies thousands and thousands of years ago. So this is very close to primary source. So let's look at it here. Miriam and Aaron began to talk against Moses because of his Cushite wife. Isn't that interesting? Segregation is not recent in America. Today, and more recently in the 50s for sure, if you married somebody of a different race, a different skin color, a different religion, if a Baptist married a Catholic, major controversy for some people still today. So isn't it interesting, back in ancient times, Miriam and Aaron, Moses' brothers, or Moses' family, began to talk against Moses. Why? Because he married a Cushite wife. Interesting. For he had married a Cushite. Has the Lord spoken only through Moses, they asked? Hasn't he also spoken through us? And the Lord heard this. Now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. Notice, parentheses, probably was added later as a little commentary to the oral tradition. And at once the Lord said to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, come out to the tent of meeting, all three of you. So the three of them went out. Then the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud. He stood at the entrance to the tent and summoned Aaron and Miriam. When the two of them stepped forward, he said, listen to my words. And remember, this is about Moses. When there is a prophet, one of our words, among you, I, the Lord, reveal myself to them in visions. I speak to them in dreams. But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly and not in riddles. Very interesting. He sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? The anger of the Lord burned against them, and he left them. So bottom line, huge stuff going on here. Our main goal today, we want a little top slide on Black history. We're tying in the time period we're studying with ancient Israelites. Tomorrow we're going to go into more sourcing and do our Epic Thursday, Friday. But today I want a top slide on Black history, not just in America, all the way back. And you can tie into different elements, racism, prejudice, because look, prejudice back here. But the one thing we know, Martin Luther King said it, our country is based on it. And right here, the Lord, if you whether or not we believe this is true, but from the scriptures, from the Jewish, Christian, Islam traditions, God puts his stamp on it that race, it does not matter. We should embrace everybody's differences. All men and women are created equal in the eyes of the Lord. That's in the Constitution, that's in the Bible, and that's the way we should all live. So it's fun to study like ancient American traditions, Black traditions, Hispanic traditions, Mexican American traditions, Mayan traditions, Asian traditions. All these different histories are just fascinating. And we want to see how different people didn't get a fair shake while at the same time not repeating the pattern of discriminating or even creating these separate classes, because we all should see each other as human beings and equal. So powerful messages here and in the video. All right, let's go to our basics. You're going to have a little bit of time, but not much as usual. But tying Black History Month into ancient history and biblical primary sources. The basics. Create a Black History Month top slide. Include CER. Make sure to cite evidence of ancient Black history using a quote from the article. I spelled that wrong. And mention something from recent American history from the video. Include images, quotes, thoughts for your top slide. We will share these on Thursday before our Thursday, Friday epic. Your links are here, your articles here, your videos here. Black history top slide, make it a cool one. Do your own research if you want. Find images if you want. Bring your own perspective into it if you want. But don't forget to talk about how the history goes all the way back into Numbers and that Moses actually married a Cushite. Interesting. All right, let's get started. If you're in Zoom, we'll do breakout rooms. We'll share out. Oh, last thing. Probably don't have much time, but I want to show Samantha. Samantha, man, great, cool, very cool how she has her stuff. We're not going to do the whole thing, but look at this. She already has a CER. She's at A level already. She has her King Saul, First Temple Judaism, David and Goliath, King David, Assyrian Siege of Jerusalem, Second Temple Judaism, Diaspora. A diaspora is a scattered population whose origin lies in a separate geographical locale. Historically, the word diaspora was used to refer to the mass dispersion of population from its indigenous territories, specifically the dispersion of Jews. And here you have, they're showing the map of where people have spread out into different parts of the world. And so you can see that there. Great one. Man, good slideshow. So tomorrow we're going to watch a little bit video from our other two videos. And we're going to do another top slide, CR, comparing primary and secondary sources, Jewish temple destroyed, timelines. Really great job, Samantha. We're going to dive more into these tomorrow. Get going on your top slide, Black History Slide. Let's do this.